I'm Calla Bennett, 29 years old, and everything changed when my cousin Isla stood up at her engagement party, champagne flute in hand, and decided to humiliate me in front of our entire extended family. The Ramirez Brooks clan had gathered at the upscale rooftop venue in downtown Seattle, 83 people dressed in their finest clothes, celebrating Isla's engagement to Grayson Ellington Voss, whose family owned half the tech startups in the Pacific Northwest. The evening had been perfect until that moment, with string lights twinkling overhead and the city skyline providing a backdrop that screamed money and success. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how one cruel comment led to the most expensive lesson my family ever learned. The trouble started when I arrived at the party, carrying a small, elegantly wrapped gift. I'd chosen it carefully, a vintage Cartier bracelet I'd found at an estate sale. Something beautiful, but not ostentatious. My family had always seen me as the struggling one, the graphic designer who worked from her cramped apartment, taking on small projects and barely making ends meet. At least, that's what I let them believe. The truth was more complicated, but I'd learned years ago that revealing my actual financial situation would change everything, and not necessarily for the better. My parents, Vivian and Thomas, had raised me to be modest about success, though they'd never quite grasped that I'd achieved more than they realized. Isla had been holding court near the champagne fountain, her 3-carat engagement ring catching the light every time she gestured. She was everything our family admired: beautiful, charming, engaged to old money, and blessed with the kind of effortless confidence that made rooms full of people gravitate toward her. I'd watched her work the crowd all evening, accepting congratulations and compliments with practiced grace. When I approached to give her my gift, she'd smiled that perfect smile and accepted it with apparent gratitude. But something in her expression shifted when she opened it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the quality of the piece. That's when she stood up and called for everyone's attention. The conversation gradually died down as 83 pairs of eyes turned toward her, expecting another gracious thank you speech or perhaps an announcement about wedding plans. Instead, Isla's voice carried across the rooftop with crystalline clarity. "I just want to say something about gift giving and what it really means to be family," she began, her tone warm but somehow pointed. Some people think throwing money around makes them important, that expensive presents are how you show love. Her gaze found mine across the crowd, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized where this was heading. "But real family celebrates with presents, not presents," she continued, her voice growing stronger as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Real family shows up emotionally, not just financially. They invest time and genuine care, not just whatever this is supposed to prove." She held up the bracelet, and I watched as several family members nodded approvingly at her words. Uncle Derek beamed with pride at his daughter's wisdom. Grandma May dabbed at her eyes, moved by what she saw as profound insight about family values. My own mother, Vivian, was nodding along, probably thinking about all the times she'd told me I needed to be more present for family events instead of always working. The silence that followed felt eternal. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention, the unspoken judgment about my supposed priorities. Some faces showed pity, others mild disapproval, and a few displayed that particular satisfaction people get when someone else's flaws are publicly exposed. I managed to keep my expression neutral, even managed a small smile as I met Isla's triumphant gaze. "Absolutely," I said, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning in my chest. "You're completely right about what really matters." The crowd began to relax, conversation slowly resuming as the moment passed, but I could still feel the occasional glance in my direction, the subtle shift in how people were looking at me. I stayed for another hour, made polite conversation, and congratulated Grayson on his choice of venue. I complimented Aunt Celeste on her dress and asked Cousin Drew about his new job. I played the part of the chastened family member who had learned an important lesson about priorities and humility. Inside, though, something cold and calculating was taking shape. As I drove home through the Seattle streets, Isla's words echoed in my mind, each repetition stoking a fury I'd been suppressing for years. She wanted to talk about real family and genuine investment. She had no idea how much I'd genuinely invested in this family, how much of my actual money had quietly solved their problems, while they credited luck, hard work, or divine intervention for their good fortune. At 11:47 p.m., I sat in my apartment with my laptop open and my phone in hand. The venue contract for Isla's wedding was in my name, paid for with my credit card as an early wedding gift I'd planned to surprise her with next week. $65,000 for the premier package at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, including flowers, catering, and coordination services. I'd spent weeks working with Camille Thornton, the venue manager, to ensure every detail would be perfect for Isla's dream wedding. Now, staring at the contract terms on my screen, I noticed the cancellation policy. 48 hours notice required for full refund. It was currently 11:47 p.m. on Saturday. The wedding was set for 3 months from now. I picked up my phone and dialed the venue's emergency contact number. Camille answered on the third ring, her voice professional despite the late hour. Fairmont Olympic Hotel Events. This is Camille. I took a deep breath, thinking about Isla's speech, about the 83 people who had watched her publicly shame me for caring too much about expensive gestures. Hi Camille, this is Calla Bennett. I need to cancel the Ramirez-Brooks wedding scheduled for June 15th. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, did you say cancel? The entire event? Yes, I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. The entire $65,000 package, effective immediately. The call with Camille Thornton lasted 37 minutes, most of it spent on hold while she consulted with management about the sudden cancellation of what she kept referring to as one of our premium packages. When she came back on the line, her voice carried a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed curiosity. Ms. Bennett, I have to ask, is everything all right? This is quite sudden for such an elaborate event. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, probably the thick folder of notes we'd accumulated over weeks of planning meetings. Everything's fine, I told her, which was both completely true and utterly false. There's just been a change in circumstances. What Camille didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that this wedding cancellation was just the beginning of a much larger unraveling. As I hung up the phone and opened my laptop to review my financial records, the scope of my secret involvement in their lives spread across multiple spreadsheets like a roadmap of hidden generosity. For 8 years, since I'd graduated college and started my design consultancy, I'd been the invisible financial backbone of the Ramirez-Brooks family, not through dramatic gestures or obvious gifts, but through a carefully constructed web of quiet support that let everyone maintain their pride while I solved their problems from the shadows. The list was longer than I'd realized when I saw it all compiled in one place. Isla's student loans, $45,000, paid off in chunks over 2 years, while she told everyone she'd received a partial scholarship and worked extra shifts at a campus coffee shop. I'd routed the payments through a fake scholarship foundation I'd created, complete with official letterhead and a congratulatory letter about her academic excellence and community involvement. She'd framed that letter and hung it in her first apartment, proudly showing it to anyone who visited. Uncle Derek's struggling insurance agency had received what he thought was a business loan from a private investor, $25,000, that had kept him from bankruptcy during the 2020 lockdowns. He'd never questioned why the interest rate was so favorable, or why the investor never called to check on his progress. Grandma May's medical bills were perhaps the most complex deception. When she'd had her heart surgery 3 years ago, the family had panicked about the costs her Medicare wouldn't cover. Somehow, mysteriously, her supplemental insurance had covered far more than expected, and what the family didn't know was that I'd been paying the insurance company directly, covering the premiums and co-pays through a series of carefully orchestrated transfers. Grandma May credited her good fortune to God's providence and excellent planning, never suspecting that Providence had my bank account number, and excellent planning involved me spending hours on the phone with insurance representatives. The pattern extended beyond immediate family. When Cousin Drew had gotten into legal trouble after his DUI, the family had been amazed when a pro bono lawyer had taken his case. That lawyer hadn't been pro bono. I'd paid his fees through a legal aid foundation I'd quietly donated to with the specific request that they help Drew. When the Wongs had faced foreclosure on their restaurant during the pandemic, they'd received an anonymous tip about a grant program that covered exactly their outstanding debt. That grant program had been me, working through a small business advocacy group I'd funded specifically for situations like theirs. My phone started ringing at 6:23 a.m. Isla's name flashed on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 6:25, then 6:27, then continuously until I finally answered at 6:31. "Calla, what the hell happened?" Her voice was shrill with panic, none of the composed elegance from the night before. "I just got a call from the venue saying our wedding was canceled. They said you canceled it. That makes no sense." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake despite having fallen asleep only 3 hours earlier. "I did cancel it," I said simply. "Why would you do that? Are you insane? Do you know how hard it was to book that venue? Grayson's parents specifically requested the Fairmont because that's where his grandparents were married." The conversation that followed revealed just how little Isla actually knew about her own wedding planning. She'd assumed the deposit had come from Grayson's family, Or perhaps from Uncle Derek, who had been talking proudly about how he was taking care of everything for his daughter's special day. When I explained that I had been the one to book and pay for the venue, the silence on her end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "That's impossible," she finally said. "You can't afford something like that. You work from your apartment doing logos for local businesses." The dismissal in her voice, even in the midst of her panic, reminded me exactly why I'd made the call to Camille Thornton. My mother called 47 minutes later, having clearly spoken to Isla first. "Calla, honey, I don't understand what's happening," Vivian said, her voice carrying that particular strain she got when family drama threatened her carefully maintained peace. "Isla says you canceled her wedding venue, but that can't be right. She must have misunderstood something." I could hear my father's voice in the background, asking questions I couldn't quite make out. "It's not a misunderstanding, Mom," I said. "I paid for the venue, and I canceled it." The pause that followed was filled with the sound of my mother trying to process information that didn't fit her understanding of my financial situation. "Where did you get $65,000? She asked finally, her voice small with confusion. It was the first time anyone in my family had directly asked about my money, and I realized that their ignorance about my success had been as carefully maintained as my secrecy about their dependence on me. "I've been doing well with my business," I said, which was technically true, though vastly understated. "Better than any of you realized." I could hear her sharing this information with my father, their muffled conversation revealing the shock of parents discovering their child had been capable of far more than they'd given her credit for. But Vivian's concern wasn't really about my success. It was about the disruption to family harmony. "You need to call them back and fix this," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used when I was a teenager. Whatever Isla said last night, I'm sure she didn't mean it the way it sounded. You know how nervous she gets at big events. This is her wedding, Calla. You can't ruin her wedding over hurt feelings. The phrase hurt feelings landed like a slap, reducing my years of financial sacrifice and the previous night's public humiliation to a minor emotional overreaction that I should simply get over for the sake of family peace. I spent the rest of the morning fielding similar calls. Derek called to yell at me about destroying his daughter's happiness. Aunt Celeste called crying about how hard it would be to find another venue on such short notice. Even Cousin Talia called to ask if I'd completely lost my mind. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Shock at the revelation that I had money, followed by immediate demands that I fix the situation I'd created. No one asked why I'd been secretly paying for things. No one questioned what other financial support I might have been providing. The focus was entirely on my responsibility to restore the status quo, to put things back the way they were so everyone could continue believing what they wanted to believe about who I was and what I was capable of. By noon, my phone was buzzing constantly with text messages from family members who had heard various versions of the story. The narrative that was emerging painted me as unstable, jealous, and vindictive, someone who had somehow gotten access to money and was now using it to punish Isla for speaking honestly about family values. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family who had benefited from my hidden generosity for years was now casting me as the villain for withdrawing that generosity. They wanted my money, but not my agency over how it was used. The final call of the day came from Camille Thornton at the venue. "Ms. Bennett, I hope you don't mind me calling, but we've had several people contact us today, claiming to represent the Ramirez-Brooks family. Some of them seem to think there's been a mistake or that someone other than you had the authority to cancel this event." Her tone was carefully professional, but I could hear the question underneath. "There's no mistake," I told her. "I booked the event, I paid for it, and I canceled it. No one else has any authority over this contract." She was quiet for a moment before responding. "I understand. It's just that we've never had a situation quite like this before. The bride's father called this morning offering to pay the deposit himself to reinstate the booking, but of course we've already released the date to another client." As I hung up, I realized that the real unraveling was just beginning. For 8 years, I'd maintained the careful fiction that my family's good fortune was the result of their own hard work, smart planning, and occasional lucky breaks. Now that fiction was starting to crack, and the truth underneath was going to be much more complicated than anyone was prepared for. They'd wanted me to learn about real family values and the importance of presence over presence. They were about to discover just how present my money had been in their lives, and just how absent their problems would become when that presence was withdrawn. The first sign that my financial withdrawal would have consequences beyond the wedding venue came Tuesday morning when Isla called, her voice tight with controlled panic. She'd spent the weekend frantically calling every upscale venue in Seattle, only to discover what Camille Thornton had already told me. Prime wedding dates in June were booked 18 months in advance, and cancellations at venues of the Fairmont's caliber were immediately snapped up by couples on extensive waiting lists. The best I can find is the community center in Bellevue, Isla said, her voice hollow with defeat. The one with the fluorescent lighting and the folding chairs. Grayson's grandmother is going to have a stroke. What Isla didn't know was that her venue crisis was about to become the least of her problems. As I sat in my apartment that morning, reviewing the intricate web of financial support I'd woven around my family over the years, I began making a series of quiet phone calls that would systematically remove every invisible safety net I'd constructed. The process felt oddly therapeutic, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for 8 years. Each call was brief, professional, and devastating in its implications for people who had no idea how much they'd come to depend on my hidden generosity. My first call was to Paula Elias at Elias & Company. Events, the catering company Isla had chosen for her reception. What the family didn't know was that I'd been listed as the financial guarantor for their services, a common practice for large events where the actual client might not have sufficient credit history. I need to remove myself as guarantor for the Ramirez Brooks event, I told Paula, who immediately began clicking through her computer files. Oh, she said after a moment, her tone shifting from professional to concerned. That's going to be a problem. Without a guarantor, we'll need the full payment upfront, and from what I can see here, the current payment schedule shows a significant outstanding balance. The conversation revealed another layer of my family's financial dependence that even I had forgotten about. Uncle Derek had insisted on handling the catering arrangements himself, proudly telling everyone he'd negotiated an excellent deal with a premium company. What he'd actually done was sign a contract he couldn't afford, banking on the assumption that somehow the money would work itself out before the final payment was due. My role as guarantor had made the contract possible, and my withdrawal of that guarantee meant Elias & Company would be calling Derek within 24 hours, demanding immediate payment of $18,000. The next call was to Ever After Bridal Boutique, where I'd quietly handled the final payment for Isla's wedding dress during what she thought was a store-wide sale. Maeve answered the phone, her voice bright with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who spent her days helping brides find their perfect gown. "Oh, Miss Bennett," she said when I identified myself. "I'm so glad you called. We have Isla's dress ready for final alterations, but there's been some confusion about the payment. The card we have on file was declined yesterday when we tried to process the alteration fees." The dress situation was more complicated than a simple declined payment. I'd originally paid for the gown itself through a layaway program, making payments over 6 months while Isla assumed she was paying it off herself with money she thought came from her own savings account. What she didn't know was that I'd been depositing money into that account every month, timed to arrive just before her dress payments were due. The alteration fees, however, were supposed to come from her own resources, and apparently those resources were more limited than she'd led everyone to believe. "We've left several messages for Isla," Maeve continued, "but she hasn't returned our calls. The dress needs significant alterations, and with the wedding date so close, we really need to get started. The total for alterations will be $1,200, and our policy requires payment before we begin any work." I could hear the concern in her voice. This was clearly a larger alteration fee than most brides expected, suggesting that Isla had ordered a dress in the wrong size, probably because she'd been trying to save money on the premium sizing options. The most significant call, however, was to Nico Harper, the private investigator I'd hired 3 years earlier to conduct background checks on potential business partners. Nico had become my go-to person for discreet financial inquiries, and I'd kept him on a small monthly retainer for occasional services. "I need you to stop the monthly payments to the Ramirez Medical Fund," I told him. This was perhaps the most complex of my family's support systems, a medical bill management service I'd created to handle Grandma May's ongoing healthcare costs. Every month, Nico would route payments from my accounts to various medical providers, insurance companies, and prescription services, ensuring that Grandma May never saw a bill that would cause the family financial stress. "That's going to leave some significant gaps in coverage," Nico warned me. "The next round of payments is due Friday, and we're talking about ongoing costs for multiple specialists, medications, and therapy services. Without those payments, the family is going to start receiving bills immediately." The monthly cost had grown over the years as Grandma May's health needs increased and was now approaching $4,000 a month. The family believed her excellent insurance was covering everything, never questioning why her premiums never seemed to increase, or why her copays were always so manageable. By Wednesday afternoon, the first cracks in my family's financial facade were beginning to show. Derek called me, his voice strained with confusion and growing panic. "Kala, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," he said. "The catering company is saying I need to pay $18,000 by Friday, or they're canceling the contract. But that doesn't make sense, because I was told the payment schedule was spread out over 3 months. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, probably the contract he was reading for the first time since signing it. What does the contract say? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Derek was quiet for a long moment, presumably reading the fine print he'd ignored when Paula Elias had explained the terms 3 months earlier. It says something about a financial guarantor, he said slowly. Someone named Calla Bennett. That's you, isn't it? The realization in his voice was painful to hear. The slow understanding that his daughter's wedding arrangements had been built on a foundation he'd never seen. I was the guarantor, I confirmed. I removed myself on Monday. The silence that followed was filled with Derek's growing comprehension of how many other arrangements might be similarly structured. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally, his voice small with embarrassment. You let me think I was handling everything myself. The hurt in his voice almost made me reconsider what I was doing. But then I remembered Isla's speech about throwing money around and real family values, and my resolve hardened. The situation escalated Thursday morning when Grayson's parents, the formidable Voss family, requested a meeting with Derek to discuss the financial irregularities surrounding the wedding planning. Apparently, the venue cancellation had raised questions about the family's financial stability, and the subsequent catering crisis had confirmed their worst suspicions. Isla called me in tears after the meeting, her composure finally cracking under the pressure of her crumbling wedding plans and her fiancé's family's growing concerns. They think we're poor, she sobbed into the phone. Grayson's mother asked Derek point blank if we could afford this wedding, and he couldn't give her a straight answer because he doesn't understand what's happening with all these contracts and payments. She actually suggested we postpone the wedding until we could get our financial house in order. The irony wasn't lost on me that Isla, who had lectured me about real family values and the importance of presents over presents, was now devastated that her future in-laws were questioning her family's financial worth. The crisis deepened when Grandma May called Friday evening, her voice shaky with confusion and worry. Calla, dear, I got the strangest bills in the mail today, she said. The insurance company is saying I owe money for my medications, and Dr. Patterson's office is asking for payment on my last 3 visits. But that doesn't make sense because my insurance always covers everything. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision I'd made, and its impact on the one family member who had never treated me with anything but kindness. There might have been some changes to your coverage, Grandma, I said carefully. You should probably call them to sort it out. What I didn't tell her was that the bills totaling over $6,000 were just the beginning, and that similar bills would be arriving every month until someone in the family figured out how to manage her actual medical costs. The pills she needed for her heart condition alone cost $800 a month without the supplemental coverage I'd been providing. That weekend, as my family scrambled to understand the sudden collapse of financial arrangements they'd never known existed, I received a text from Cousin Drew. Family meeting Sunday at Mom and Dad's. Everyone needs to be there. We need to figure out what's happening. The message was followed by similar texts from other family members, all demanding answers, all assuming that this crisis was something that had happened to them rather than something I had deliberately orchestrated. As I read through the increasingly frantic messages, I realized that my family was about to discover something they'd never bothered to investigate. The difference between actually being financially stable and simply being supported by someone who was. They were about to learn that their comfortable lives had been subsidized by the same person they'd dismissed as financially struggling, and that lesson was going to cost them far more than the $65,000 I'd spent on a wedding venue they now couldn't use. The family meeting took place at Derek and Celeste's house on Sunday afternoon, and I could feel the tension before I even walked through the front door. 23 family members had gathered in their living room, more people than I'd seen assembled since last Christmas, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from confused to accusatory. Derek had arranged folding chairs in a rough circle, giving the whole gathering the feeling of an intervention. Isla sat next to Grayson on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, while Grandma May occupied her usual spot in Derek's recliner, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. What none of them knew was that Nico Harper had spent the week conducting the most thorough investigation of his career, not into a potential business partner or a suspicious employee, but into me. Grayson's parents, the Voss family, had hired him to perform what they called due diligence on their future daughter-in-law's family after the venue cancellation and catering crisis had raised red flags about financial stability. Nico had called me Friday afternoon to give me a heads up about the investigation. Professional courtesy from one client to another, though he couldn't share the specific details of what the Voss family had requested. Before we start, Derek announced, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone trying to control a situation he didn't understand. I want everyone to know that we're here to solve problems, not assign blame. Something strange has been happening with wedding arrangements and family finances, and we need to get to the bottom of it. He gestured toward a stack of papers on the coffee table, contracts and bills, and correspondence that painted a picture of financial chaos. Kala has been involved in some of these arrangements in ways that none of us understood, and we need clarity about what's been happening. The intervention format Derek had chosen backfired spectacularly when Vivian stood up and addressed me directly. "Honey, we're all concerned about you," she said, her voice gentle but patronizing. "Taking on financial obligations you can't afford, making impulsive decisions about other people's events, this isn't like you. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" The suggestion that my actions were the result of mental instability, rather than calculated decision-making, revealed just how little my family understood about my actual capabilities, both financial and strategic. I was about to respond when the doorbell rang, interrupting the carefully orchestrated family meeting with an arrival no one had expected. Derek answered the door to find Nico Harper standing on the porch, a thick manila envelope in his hand and an expression of professional discomfort on his face. "Mr. Ramirez," Nico said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. "I'm here representing the Voss family. They've requested that I share the results of our investigation with you directly." The silence that followed Nico's entrance was deafening. Grayson shifted uncomfortably on the couch, clearly aware that his parents had initiated an investigation, but apparently unprepared for the results to be delivered during a family meeting. Isla's face went pale as she realized that her future in-laws had been investigating her family's finances, a level of scrutiny that suggested serious concerns about the upcoming marriage. Derek looked confused and slightly offended, the expression of a man who wasn't used to being investigated by anyone. "What kind of investigation?" Derek asked, his voice tight with defensive anger. Nico opened the envelope and pulled out a comprehensive financial report, the kind of document that had taken considerable time and resources to compile. The Voss family requested a complete financial background check on all immediate family members involved in the wedding planning, he explained. "What we found was unexpected." He glanced at me, and I saw something like professional admiration in his expression. The report Nico delivered systematically dismantled every assumption my family had made about their own financial stability over the past 8 years. Page by page, he documented the hidden transfers, the anonymous payments, the carefully constructed support systems that had kept everyone comfortable while maintaining the illusion of independence. Uncle Derek's business loan had come from an LLC registered to me. Grandma May's medical coverage was being provided by a medical fund I'd established and maintained. Isla's college expenses had been paid through a scholarship foundation that existed only on paper and in my bank account. "The individual at the center of these arrangements," Nico continued, consulting his notes with professional detachment, "is Kala Bennett, who appears to have a personal net worth of approximately $1.2 million, primarily from early investments in Tesla stock and Bitcoin during the 2020 market downturn." The figure hit the room like a physical blow, faces turning toward me with expressions of shock and disbelief. My mother's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Derek stared at the papers in Nico's hand as if they were written in a foreign language. "That's impossible," Isla said, her voice shrill with denial. "She works from her apartment doing graphics for small businesses. She drives a 10-year-old Honda." The desperate edge in her voice revealed how crucial it was to her self-image that I remained the struggling family member she could pity and condescend to. "The investigation was quite thorough," Nico replied diplomatically. "Ms. Bennett has been operating New Horizon Design Studio as a full-service consultancy with clients across multiple states. Her reported income for the past 3 years has averaged $200,000 annually." The room erupted in overlapping conversations as family members tried to process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Cousin Talia demanded to see proof, while Uncle Joel asked pointed questions about tax implications. Aunt Lillian kept repeating, "I don't understand," like a mantra, her voice getting higher with each repetition. Through it all, Grandma May sat quietly in the recliner, her sharp eyes moving from the papers to my face and back again, the only person in the room who seemed to be putting pieces together rather than rejecting the new information. The most damaging revelation came when Nico detailed the timeline of financial support. The pattern suggests that Ms. Bennett has been providing substantial financial assistance to multiple family members since 2016, he read from his report. In many cases, family members were unaware that their good fortune was the result of her intervention. For example, Mr. Derek Ramirez's business received a $25,000 infusion in March 2020, which he believes came from a private investor. That investor was actually Ms. Bennett, operating through a business loan company she established for this purpose. Derek's face went through a series of color changes as the implications hit him. His insurance agency, which he'd spent years bragging about rescuing through his own shrewd business decisions and relationship building, had actually been saved by his niece's money. The private investor he'd occasionally mentioned to clients as proof of his business acumen was sitting across the room from him, watching him process the truth with something approaching clinical detachment. The medical expenses for Mrs. May Ramirez, Nico continued, have been managed through a complex arrangement involving supplemental insurance payments and direct bill management. The family believes her excellent insurance coverage is responsible for her low out-of-pocket costs, but actually, Ms. Bennett has been covering approximately $4,000 monthly in medical expenses that would otherwise fall to the family. This revelation finally broke Grandma May's composure, tears starting to flow down her cheeks as she realized the scope of what I'd been doing. The final bombshell came when Nico addressed Isla directly. Ms. Ramirez Brooks, the investigation revealed that your college education was funded through a combination of legitimate financial aid and payments from a scholarship foundation that appears to be entirely fictional. The foundation exists only as a mailing address and a bank account, both registered to Ms. Bennett. The perfectly framed scholarship letter hanging in Isla's apartment suddenly took on a different meaning, a piece of elaborate theater designed to protect her pride while solving her financial problems. Grayson spoke for the first time since Nico's arrival, his voice carefully controlled but clearly strained. This investigation was requested because my parents were concerned about financial irregularities surrounding our wedding. What they found was apparently financial stability that was hidden rather than financial instability that was obvious. His tone suggested that he was trying to process whether this news was good or bad for his upcoming marriage, whether having a secretly wealthy family member was better or worse than having financially struggling relatives. The room fell silent as Nico finished his presentation and prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, Grandma May's voice cut through the quiet with surprising strength. "Kala," she said, her words carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through enough family drama to recognize truth when she heard it. "Is this why you canceled the wedding venue? Because you'd been paying for everything and nobody knew?" The directness of her question forced everyone to confront the connection between my financial revelations and the crisis that had brought us all together. "Yes," I said simply, my voice steady despite the weight of 23 pairs of eyes staring at me. "I've been quietly supporting this family for 8 years, and when Isla stood up at her engagement party to lecture me about throwing money around and real family values, I decided it was time for everyone to see what throwing money around actually looked like." The silence that followed my admission was different from the confused quiet that had marked Nico's presentation. This silence was heavy with recognition, with the dawning understanding that the family's comfortable stability had been built on a foundation they'd never bothered to examine. Derek was the first to break, his voice cracking as he asked the question that would define everything that came next. "If you've been doing all this, if you've been supporting all of us this whole time, why didn't you ever tell us?" The pain in his voice was genuine, the confusion of a man discovering that his independence had been an illusion. "Because," I replied, thinking of all the times my success had been dismissed or minimized, all the times my family had made it clear that they preferred to see me as the one who needed help rather than the one providing it. "You never asked." The week following Nico Harper's devastating presentation became what Cousin Drew would later refer to as the Great Family Civil War, with battle lines drawn in ways that split households and turned Sunday dinners into strategic planning sessions. The Harpers, led by Drew's father, Uncle Joel, immediately sided with me, declaring that I'd been criminally underappreciated and demanding that everyone apologize immediately. The Wongs took the opposite position, with Aunt Lillian arguing that my secrecy had been manipulative and that healthy families don't operate through deception. Uncle Derek found himself caught in the middle, torn between gratitude for the financial support that had saved his business and fury that his accomplishments had been based on what he saw as charity. What made the situation exponentially worse was the growing strain on my parents' marriage, a 28-year relationship that was fracturing under the weight of secrets and conflicting loyalties. Thomas had known about some of my financial interventions, particularly the business loan to Derek and a portion of Grandma May's medical expenses, but he'd agreed to keep quiet because he believed my desire for privacy should be respected. Vivian felt betrayed not just by my secrecy, but by her husband's complicity in maintaining it. Their fights could be heard through the thin walls of their duplex, loud enough that neighbors began asking if everything was all right. "You let me worry about Derek's business for months," Vivian screamed during one particularly explosive argument that Thomas later recounted to me. "I was losing sleep thinking about Dad's medical bills, and you knew the whole time that Kala was handling everything. You made me feel like a terrible daughter for not being able to help more." The revelation that Thomas had been carrying the weight of family financial secrets had shifted Vivian's anger away from me and toward her husband, creating a rift that neither of them seemed capable of bridging. The crisis reached a breaking point Wednesday evening when Isla called me, her voice carrying a manic edge that immediately set off alarm bells. "I did something," she said without preamble, her words slightly slurred in a way that suggested she'd been drinking. "Something to make everyone see what you've really done to this family." She was calling from the emergency room at Swedish Medical Center, where she'd been brought after what she described as a suicide attempt, though the details she provided made it clear that the attempt had been more theatrical than genuine. According to the story, Isla told the medical staff, family members, and anyone else who would listen, she'd taken a handful of pills after becoming overwhelmed by the guilt and shame of discovering that her entire adult life had been subsidized by someone she'd publicly humiliated. The pills, however, turned out to be over-the-counter sleep aids, taken in quantities that would cause nausea and drowsiness but pose no serious medical risk. The timing of the attempt, exactly 3 hours after she'd posted a dramatic message on social media about family betrayal and hidden agendas, suggested a level of calculation that undermined the spontaneous desperation she was claiming. The emergency room visit accomplished exactly what Isla had intended. It shifted the family narrative away from my years of secret generosity and toward her current suffering. Suddenly, I wasn't the underappreciated family member who had been quietly solving everyone's problems. I was the cruel relative whose actions had driven a young woman to attempt self-harm. Derek and Celeste rushed to the hospital, followed by a parade of family members who wanted to show support for Isla while pointedly avoiding any contact with me. "She's fragile right now," Derek told me when I called to check on Isla's condition. "The doctor says she's experiencing severe anxiety related to the wedding stress and these financial revelations. Maybe it would be better if you stayed away for a while until things calm down." The suggestion that I was somehow responsible for Isla's mental health crisis was both infuriating and predictable. The latest iteration of a family pattern where problems were always someone else's fault and solutions always someone else's responsibility. But Isla's dramatic gesture backfired in ways she hadn't anticipated when my business clients began reaching out with concerns about the social media posts she'd been making. The Haven Circle, my core group of long-term clients, had seen Isla's increasingly erratic online behavior and wanted to understand what was happening. Several of them had met Isla at business events over the years, where she'd presented herself as my business partner rather than my cousin, taking credit for design work and strategic decisions that were entirely my own. The conversation with Patricia Chen, CEO of a tech startup that had been my client for 3 years, revealed the depth of Isla's deception. "I have to ask," Patricia said during our scheduled check-in call, "is everything all right with your business partner? I saw some concerning posts on her social media about family conflicts and mental health struggles. Should I be worried about the stability of our working relationship?" The confusion in Patricia's voice was evident as she tried to reconcile the professional, competent person she'd been working with and the unstable individual posting cryptic messages about betrayal and suicide. "Isla isn't my business partner," I told Patricia, feeling a familiar surge of anger at my cousin's appropriation of my professional identity. "She's my cousin, and she's never been involved in my business in any capacity." The silence that followed was heavy with Patricia's growing understanding that she'd been misled about the structure of my company. "But she was at the client dinner last month," Patricia said slowly. "She introduced herself as your creative director and talked about the rebranding strategy we discussed. She seemed to know all the details of our project." The revelation that Isla had been infiltrating my professional relationships and claiming credit for my work added a new dimension to the family crisis. Phone calls to other clients revealed a pattern of deception that extended back nearly 2 years, with Isla gradually inserting herself into my business events and networking functions. She'd been careful to target clients who worked with me remotely, people who wouldn't know that the confident woman discussing their projects wasn't actually involved in creating them. Marcus Williams, owner of a restaurant chain I'd helped rebrand, confirmed that Isla had attended a conference in Portland where she'd presented herself as the senior designer behind his company's new logo. "She had business cards and everything," Marcus told me, his voice reflecting his confusion about the situation. "She knew enough about our project to answer detailed questions, and she gave me her contact information for future work." The business cards were news to me, and I wondered how long Isla had been planning to branch off from my established client relationships and take them with her. The professional crisis escalated when 3 potential clients called to cancel preliminary meetings, citing concerns about the instability they'd witnessed on social media. The damage to my reputation was immediate and tangible, the result of Isla's decision to air family grievances in a public forum where they intersected with my business identity. Years of careful relationship building and professional credibility were being undermined by someone who had already taken credit for much of the work that had established that credibility in the first place. Amber, my friend from the early diner days who had since become a successful real estate agent, provided the outside perspective I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. "Your cousin has been telling people for months that she's the real talent behind your business," Amber told me over coffee Thursday morning. "She's been saying that you handle the administrative side while she does the creative work." I didn't say anything because I thought maybe you'd brought her on as a partner and just hadn't mentioned it. The conversation with Amber revealed that Isla's campaign to appropriate my professional identity had been even more systematic than I'd realized. She'd been attending local business networking events, introducing herself as the creative force behind New Horizon Design Studio's success. She'd cultivated relationships with other professionals in the design industry, positioning herself as someone who was being held back by an overly controlling business partner who didn't appreciate her contributions. "She's been building her own client base using your reputation," Amber continued, her voice heavy with the discomfort of delivering bad news to a friend. "I heard from Sarah Martinez that Isla's been taking on side projects, using your portfolio pieces as examples of her work. She's been telling people that she's planning to start her own agency soon, once she can disentangle herself from her current partnership." The revelation that Isla had been planning to steal my clients and my work while simultaneously accepting my financial support for her wedding was breathtaking in its audacity. Friday afternoon brought the confrontation I'd been avoiding since Nico's presentation at the family meeting. Isla appeared at my apartment door, looking haggard but determined, her hospital bracelet still visible on her wrist like a badge of victimhood. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand and it's time to fix it." Her tone carried the familiar authoritative edge she'd always used when she wanted something from me. The assumption that I would ultimately do whatever was necessary to restore family harmony. "You're right," I told her, settling into my chair with a calmness that seemed to unnerve her. "It is time to fix things. Starting with you returning the client contacts you've stolen and issuing public corrections about your role in my business." The color drained from Isla's face as she realized that I knew about her professional deceptions. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've been networking and meeting people. That's not stealing." The conversation that followed was the first honest exchange Isla and I had ever had, stripped of the family dynamics and social politeness that had always masked our fundamental incompatibility. "You've been taking credit for my work for 2 years, I said, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. "You've been telling my clients that you're my creative director while I've been paying for your wedding, your cousin's legal fees, and our grandmother's medical bills. You stood up at your engagement party and lectured me about throwing money around while you were literally living off money I was throwing around." Isla's response revealed the depth of her delusion about our relationship and her contributions to my success. "I helped you build this business," she said, her voice rising with defensive anger. "You never would have gotten those clients without my networking and relationship building. You're too introverted to succeed on your own. I've been your face in the business community while you hide behind your computer designing logos." The accusation that my professional success was somehow dependent on her social skills was both infuriating and revealing of how she'd justified her appropriation of my work. As I listened to Isla's attempts to rewrite history and minimize my contributions to my own business, I realized that the family crisis we were experiencing wasn't really about money or secrets or wedding venues. It was about recognition, about credit, about who got to be seen as successful and competent and worthy of respect. For years, Isla had been comfortable with our family dynamic because it positioned her as the golden child while casting me as the struggling one who needed guidance and support. The revelation that I had been the one providing support all along threatened the very foundation of her identity within our family system. "Here's what's going to happen," I told her, standing up to signal that our conversation was ending. "You're going to contact every client you've misled and explain that you have no connection to New Horizon Design Studio. You're going to return any business cards or materials that identify you as my employee or partner, and you're going to stop using my work in your portfolio." Isla stared at me with an expression of shock and growing fury, the look of someone who had never been held accountable for her actions and couldn't quite believe it was happening now. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice carrying a threat that felt empty even as she made it. "Then I'll make sure everyone in the business community knows exactly what you've been doing," I replied. "I'll contact every person you've networking with and provide them with documentation of your deception. I'll make sure your reputation in this industry is destroyed before it even gets started." The threat was delivered calmly, without emotion, and Isla seemed to recognize that I had both the capability and the determination to follow through on it. As she left my apartment, Isla delivered what she clearly intended as a devastating final blow. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "I'm going to tell everyone what you really are, how you've been manipulating this family for years with your money. No one's going to want to be around someone who controls people the way you do." But her threat felt hollow. The desperate move of someone who had finally realized that the power dynamic she'd always taken for granted had shifted permanently in favor of the cousin she'd spent years underestimating. The phone call that would unravel the last of Isla's carefully constructed lies came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a career counselor at the University of Washington who had worked with both Isla and me during our college years. Dr. Mitchell had maintained contact with her former students through LinkedIn and occasional alumni events, and she'd been following the explosive social media drama that had consumed my family over the past month. "Kala," she said when I answered her call on a Tuesday morning, "I've been watching what's happening with your family situation, and I think there's something you need to know about your cousin's behavior during college." What Dr. Mitchell revealed during our hour-long conversation was a systematic pattern of sabotage that explained why my early career had been so much more difficult than it should have been. During our senior year, when professors were writing recommendation letters and helping students connect with potential employers, Isla had been quietly undermining my opportunities while positioning herself as my concerned advocate. "She came to my office several times," Dr. Mitchell explained, "expressing worry about your mental health and professional readiness. She suggested that you were unstable, prone to anxiety attacks, and not prepared for the pressures of a competitive design career." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, as memories from that period suddenly took on new meaning. The graphic design internship I'd been promised at a prestigious Seattle firm had been mysteriously withdrawn after what they called concerns raised by a reference. The freelance opportunity that had seemed certain had evaporated when the client decided I might not be the right fit culturally. The pattern of near misses and last-minute rejections that had characterized my early career suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of deliberate sabotage. "I'm ashamed to admit that I believed her," Dr. Mitchell continued, her voice heavy with regret. "Isla was so articulate and seemed so genuinely concerned about your well-being. She provided specific examples of what she called episodes, where you'd become overwhelmed by pressure. She convinced me and several other faculty members that recommending you for high-stress positions would be doing you a disservice." The irony wasn't lost on me that while Isla had been convincing professors I was too fragile for professional success, I had been building the financial foundation that would later support her entire family. The conversation with Dr. Mitchell led to other revelations, as former classmates and professors began reaching out with their own pieces of the puzzle. Professor Linda Chen from the graphic design department had kept detailed notes from her meetings with students, and she shared that Isla had approached her multiple times with concerns about my erratic behavior and suggestions that I might be better suited for less demanding creative roles. Meanwhile, Isla had been positioning herself as the more stable, professionally ready candidate, volunteering to take on projects and opportunities that had originally been offered to me. Marcus Rodriguez, a classmate who had become a successful web developer, called to share his memory of a particularly damaging incident. "Isla told the whole senior design studio that you'd had a breakdown during finals week," he said. "She made it sound like you'd been hospitalized or something. Everyone was worried about you, but also kind of afraid to hire someone who might crack under pressure." The supposed breakdown had never happened. I'd simply been working intensively on my thesis project while dealing with my father's temporary unemployment, a family financial crisis that I'd solved by taking on extra freelance work. The most devastating revelation came from Jennifer Walsh, who had been the hiring manager at the design firm where I'd lost my promised internship. "Your cousin called our office," Jennifer told me during a conversation that felt surreal in its casual destruction of everything I'd believed about my early career struggles. "She said she was a close friend who felt obligated to warn us about your mental health issues. She claimed you'd been having panic attacks during presentations and that you'd told her you were considering dropping out of the program entirely." Each conversation revealed new layers of Isla's campaign against my professional reputation, a months-long effort to ensure that opportunities would flow to her instead of me. She'd contacted potential employers, spread rumors among classmates, and convinced faculty members that recommending me for competitive positions would be setting me up for failure, all while maintaining the facade of being my supportive cousin, who was concerned about my well-being and wanted to protect me from situations I couldn't handle. The pattern extended beyond college and into the early years of my design career. Elena Torres, a fellow designer who had started her own agency around the same time I'd launched New Horizon Design Studio, remembered a networking event where Isla had approached her with warnings about my reliability. "She told me you had a history of taking on projects and then disappearing when things got stressful," Elena recalled. She said your family was worried about you but didn't know how to help. It made me hesitant to refer clients to you, even though your portfolio was clearly stronger than most of the other freelancers in the area. The systematic nature of Isla's sabotage explained why building my business had required such careful relationship management and why I'd had to work twice as hard as my competitors to establish credibility with new clients. Every professional victory had been achieved despite a foundation of damaged reputation that I'd never understood or been able to address directly. The isolation that had characterized my early career years wasn't the result of my own social awkwardness or professional inexperience. It was the deliberate outcome of a campaign designed to position Isla as the successful, stable alternative to her problematic cousin. Armed with this new understanding, I began reaching out to former clients and colleagues who had seemed inexplicably cool toward me during various projects over the years. The conversations revealed a consistent pattern of whispered concerns about my reliability, my mental health, and my ability to handle pressure. In each case, the source of these concerns could be traced back to Isla, who had positioned herself as a family insider with special knowledge about my limitations and struggles. David Park, owner of a restaurant chain that had hired me for a rebranding project 3 years earlier, admitted that he'd been hesitant to give me the contract because of warnings he'd received about my work style. Someone who claimed to be your business partner called to suggest that I might want to consider working with her directly instead, he said. She implied that you were difficult to work with and that she'd been handling most of the client relationships to compensate for your social anxiety. The business partner, of course, had been Isla, inserting herself into my professional relationships while simultaneously undermining my reputation. The revelation of Isla's long-term sabotage campaign reached my family through a series of conversations that began when Dr. Mitchell called Derek to express her concerns about the family situation. Derek, still reeling from the discoveries about my financial support and struggling to understand how he'd so completely misread the family dynamics, was receptive to hearing another perspective on his daughter's behavior. The conversation left him shaken and questioning everything he thought he knew about both his daughter and his niece. 20 years, Derek said when he called me after speaking with Dr. Mitchell. She's been doing this for 20 years, since college. While you were paying for her education, she was sabotaging your career. His voice carried a hollow quality, the sound of a father confronting the possibility that his child was capable of sustained, calculating cruelty toward a family member who had shown her nothing but generosity. I don't understand how I missed this. I don't understand how she could do something like this. The family meeting that followed was smaller than the previous gathering, limited to immediate family members who were directly affected by the revelations about Isla's behavior. Grandma May, despite her age and recent health struggles, insisted on being present for what she called the final accounting. Thomas and Vivian attended together, their marriage apparently stabilized by the shared shock of learning about their niece's systematic deception. Even Uncle Joel and Aunt Lillian, who had been on opposite sides during the earlier family conflict, came together to confront the implications of what we'd discovered. Isla's response to being confronted with evidence of her sabotage campaign was a masterclass in deflection and manipulation. She alternated between denying the accusations entirely, claiming that people were misremembering conversations from years ago, and justifying her actions as necessary interventions to protect me from failure. "I was trying to help you," she insisted, when faced with Professor Chen's detailed notes about their conversations. "You weren't ready for those opportunities. You would have failed and been humiliated. I was protecting you from yourself." The justification revealed the depth of Isla's delusion about her own motivations and the impact of her actions. In her mind, she had been the stable, successful family member who had graciously tried to manage my limitations while building her own career. The idea that I had been supporting her financially while she was systematically destroying my professional reputation was too contradictory to her self-image for her to fully accept, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. "You're all turning against me," Isla said, as the family meeting progressed, and it became clear that no one was willing to defend her behavior. "Kala has manipulated everyone with her money, and now you're all choosing her over me. This family is toxic." The accusation that I had manipulated the family with money felt particularly hollow, coming from someone who had accepted that money for years while working to ensure I would never achieve the success that made such generosity possible. The final revelation came from Ezra Quinn, the photographer I'd been dating for 6 months, who had remained carefully neutral during the family crisis, but finally felt compelled to share what he'd observed. "She's been calling potential clients," he told me during a quiet dinner at his apartment. "I've seen her at networking events, introducing herself as your former business partner who left because of creative differences. She's been telling people that you stole her ideas and clients when she tried to start her own agency." Ezra's information confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, that Isla's plan to appropriate my professional identity and client base had been in development for months, possibly years. The financial support she'd been receiving from me had given her the stability to plan a careful exit strategy that would leave her with my clients, my reputation, and my portfolio while casting me as the problematic partner she'd been forced to leave behind. The justice that finally came wasn't the result of any dramatic confrontation or family intervention. It was the quiet, methodical consequence of truth being shared with the right people at the right time. Dr. Mitchell's call to the University of Washington's alumni office resulted in an investigation that led to Isla being removed from several professional organizations for misrepresenting her credentials and work history. The business cards identifying her as my creative director were reported to the state's Business Licensing Board, leading to fines for fraudulent business representation. More significantly, the design community in Seattle was smaller and more interconnected than Isla had realized. When word spread about her systematic misrepresentation of her role in my business and her attempts to steal clients through deception, the reputation she'd been trying to build crumbled overnight. The networking events she'd used to build her professional identity became venues where people whispered about her dishonesty and warned each other about her tactics. 6 months after the family meeting where Nico Harper had revealed my financial support, I received a text from Derek with a photo attached. The image showed Isla working behind the counter at a retail store, wearing a name tag and the defeated expression of someone whose grand plans had collided with reality. "She's living with us again," Derek's message read. "Can't find work and design anywhere in the city. People talk." The photo felt like closure, the visual confirmation that the consequences of her actions had finally caught up with her. Meanwhile, my own business had not only recovered from the temporary damage of Isla's social media meltdown, but had actually grown stronger. The clients who had stayed with me through the crisis became more loyal when they learned the full story of what had happened. New opportunities emerged as word spread about my resilience and professional integrity in the face of deliberate sabotage. The international expansion I'd been considering became a reality when a London-based firm approached me about establishing a European branch of New Horizon Design Studio. The personal growth that emerged from the crisis was perhaps more valuable than the professional vindication. Ezra and I moved in together, and for the first time in my adult life, I was in a relationship with someone who knew the full scope of my success and respected both my achievements and my generous spirit. Aunt Lillian, Cousin Drew, and Cousin Talia maintained regular contact, and our relationships were built on honesty rather than the hidden power dynamics that had characterized my family interactions for years. As I sat in my new home office, looking out at the Seattle skyline and preparing for a client call with a Fortune 500 company, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. The cruel comment that had started it all, Isla's lecture about throwing money around and real family values, had ultimately revealed truths that transformed everything. I had learned that the family I'd been born into valued the appearance of success over actual achievement, comfort over honesty, and harmony over justice. But I had also learned that chosen family, built on mutual respect and genuine care, was far more valuable than biological connections and maintained through obligation and hidden subsidies. The final text message I received from Isla came 8 months after that devastating family meeting. "I'm sorry," it read. "I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did was wrong." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Some apologies come too late, after too much damage, to bridge the gap they're meant to address. The sister-cousin relationship we'd once had was beyond repair, destroyed not by a moment of cruelty but by years of deliberate sabotage disguised as concern. In the end, being abandoned by my family at that engagement party hadn't been a moment of rejection. It had been a moment of liberation. Liberation from the exhausting performance of financial humility, from the burden of supporting people who were actively working against my success, and from the toxic dynamic of a family that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for people who take your generosity for granted is to stop being generous. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members who don't know how to love you back is to love yourself enough to walk away.